Hi, my name is Martin Rees, and this is my lecture on Japanese war crimes. In my lecture today, we're going to examine the topics of the Japanese war crimes, looking at the foundational Japanese culture, the actual war crimes themselves committed, the tribunal courts and how they handled prosecuting these crimes, as well as the patterns that we see present in the war and also in the post war years. Influences on a Japanese culture include the rise of the militarists, these people who, in the 1930s and 40s, exerted great influence and control over the civilian government. They did this by assassination and in a coup attempt to take over the reins of government. The government was led by an emperor. This emperor was a descendant of the Yamato race, just like the rest of the Japanese people, and because of that, they gave them a superior outlook, being divine, that the rest of humanity was subhuman. They also had a military cultural tradition. They had a samurai warrior as a shogun over their country for centuries. In the 1895's modern times, they had a victory in the First Sino-Japanese War, followed by a string of other victories on both land and sea. This gave the Japanese military a sense of hubris, that they were divine by nature, they had the right to choose, and the right to do what they wanted to do. All these influences come to play in how they treat and deal with the POWs and people in the occupied lands in terms of medical military experimentation. So, who did these war crimes? Well, the Japanese Imperial Army, specifically Unit 731, was responsible for the majority of these actions. The first medical experimentation center was set up in 1932 in Harbin, in China, and Unit 731 was not deployed until the late 1930s. They consisted of over 3,000 trained medical personnel doing these experiments. And how did General Shiro Ishii feel about all this? His picture's right there. And to quote him, he felt military medicine consists not only of the treatment and prevention, but genuine military medicine is designed for offensive warfare. So, in his philosophy, it was about finding weaponry. His subjects for all these experimentations, Chinese, POWs, and other occupied peoples. The research they conducted was on chemical weapons as well as developing new viruses and bacterial agents, things such as anthrax. They also tested the POWs and Chinese to preserve Japanese lives. Their most notable experiments was in frostbite research. The second nature of the Japanese war crimes is their use of comfort women. These are women, mostly Chinese and Korean. The Chinese consisted of up to about 200,000 women who were used in this manner, and that was about half the estimated 400,000 women who were abused during the wartime. These women were basically sexual slaves. This was a widespread practice throughout the empire, and they would have them at large bases, these military brothels, as well as down to individual units who would simply grab an unfortunate woman out of a village and then use her there at their unit level. These crimes aren't just isolated in China. Matter of fact, they occur throughout the occupied lands of the Japanese Empire, everywhere in the Pacific, as well as even in the Philippines and other locations. They represent a large scale abuse of people, hundreds of thousands of women as sexual slaves and enslavement, as well as hundreds of thousands of people being medically tortured and experimented on for research. So, after the war, how did the courts address these war crimes? Well, an example, we're going to look at the International Tribunal Court, which is Nuremberg. They had 28 medical personnel charged with crimes. The International Military Tribunal for the Far East, the American run Tokyo trials, not one charge. The Soviet War Crimes Court, well, they were unique because they actually specified criminal experiments on living humans. 12 people charged. The Chinese actually ran two different tribunals, the Nationalists in 1946 and the People's Republic of China in 1956. And both trials, no charges were filed against Japanese medical personnel. So, as a way of comparing, I've included the Nuremberg court trials. They had 12 convictions, as mentioned. Five of those people were executed, seven of them were imprisoned. But if we look at the Asian courts, we have Tokyo, the American run court, no convictions. Soviet, nine convictions. The two Chinese courts, no convictions at all. So, out of all these, there were only nine people who were sentenced to 12 years or less. So, what is the legacy of these trials? Well, first and foremost, they're a mockery of justice. You literally have hundreds, if not thousands, of people perpetrating these injustices and these acts, yet none of them are really charged. 9 people charged and convicted. That's a laughingstock. And for the victims, they have no justice. They have suffered. They were sexually enslaved, beaten, and raped. They were tortured, medically cut open, and experimented on, diseased, and gassed. But yet, none of the people doing these acts to them actually faced justice. They just lived their lives normally after the war. And also, as a comparison with the East and West one last time, Nuremberg actually did have convictions, sentences, and executions. There was punishment. But in the Asian courts, all the ones I've talked about, there was really nothing there. But part of that actually reveals some of the motives. Both the Soviet Union and the United States had an alternative motive that they wanted the research from Unit 731. They wanted that information. So, in other words, they traded justice for research. So, looking at all this, what do we see as patterns from the war and post war years? Well, during the war, both Japan and Germany committed atrocious, large scale, unprecedented scale mass murders, medical experimentation, and even sexual enslavement. In the post war years, we see that the Japanese researchers actually coveted. The U.S. covered up with no charges. The Soviets offered leniency to their 9 convicted felons. But are these crimes limited to just the war years? The answer is no. The Soviets have continued to experiment on their prisoners in the gulags, conducting poison research. In the United States, there's 2 different events. You have the Tuskegee men's syphilis trials, where they infected them and didn't treat them even though they had a cure. There was also radiation experiments conducted on hundreds of American citizens without their knowledge or warning, and that happened over a period of decades. So, in summary, the scale of World War II war crimes is unprecedented. People were tortured, experimented on, used as sexual slaves, and murdered. And how does that reflect in a post World War? Well, Japan is not unique. They committed these crimes, but the Soviets and the United States have both committed crimes on their own people in the same manner. So, what are we looking at here? What we're looking at is that justice is not served when governments take it upon themselves to experiment on their own people for their own purposes. Justice will not be served under these cases.